Hi, I'm Igor, and welcome to the very first night of Imperial College Christian Union's Events Week.
Hi, I'm Hannah, and I am so glad to have each and every one of you guys here today. The theme for Events Week this year is searching, and today we'll have a particular focus on searching for truth. Does science disprove God?
So first of all, we're going to have an interview with Professor John Lennox, so Emeritus Professor of Mathematics at Oxford, but also the author of numerous books on the relationship between faith and science. Following that, there will be a talk from our speaker for the whole week, Niv Lobo. And after that, a live Q&A to ask all your questions, so make sure you write them down.
It's our privilege this evening to begin our week searching, thinking about the big questions of life and the Christian faith with an interview with Professor John Lennox. He has an earned Doctorate of Science degree. He's the Emeritus Professor of Pure Mathematics at Oxford and the Emeritus Fellow of Pure Mathematics and Philosophy of Science at Green Templeton College. So many credentials, it's hard to get them all out. Professor Lennox, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
My pleasure to be with you at Imperial.
Well, as we begin, during the pandemic, follow the science has been a constant refrain for policymakers. It's been something we've been hearing again and again. What do you make of that as a scientist?
Well, it's a very important slogan, especially for Imperial College, because quite a lot of the research has been done there. And I think as a scientist, I want to follow the science, but I want to follow it realizing that science is very different from scientism. Scientism is the idea that science can give us answers to every question. And what has been very obvious in the pandemic, that the statistical work, for example, very important, has guided medical decisions. But many of the decisions that come crowding in are moral in their nature. How do we decide priorities? Do we deal with care homes first, or teachers first, or police first, and so on? How do we share out rare resources? Do we close schools? What about the knock-on effect on jobs? And those are huge moral decisions. And science and statistical mathematics can tell us something about the consequences of the policy decisions, but cannot answer the question, is it right to go this way or to go the other way? Einstein once said, you can talk about the ethical foundations of science, but you can't talk about the scientific foundations of ethics. So for me, science is a voice, a very important voice, perhaps the most important to be listened to. But it doesn't solve the problems of morality. And there we need a much larger framework. And I'd add that science is, we hope, rational, but it's not coextensive with rationality. Ethical decisions are rational decisions. So I look for a bigger framework. And that, of course, is where my Christianity becomes highly relevant, because it gives me a large-scale meta-narrative which gives a moral framework for facing these very, very difficult moral decisions. So as a scientist, I need something bigger than science in order to apply science correctly in the world.
Brilliant. Well, as someone with degrees in literature and theology, I'm really excited that science can't tell everyone everything. But at the same time, you said that you really value it. You think that it might be the most important voice to factor in. How do those two things fit together? It can't tell us everything, but you still consider it extremely important. What is that importance of science to you?
Well, the importance is understanding the factual situation. What is a pandemic? What are viruses? What are their effects? How are they transmitted? And all this kind of thing. Until you know that, then you're lancing in the dark, even making your moral decisions. So it's like saying which is the most important wing of an eagle to fly. It needs both to fly. But we need the factual stuff first. And the more thoroughly we understand the factual stuff, the more confidence people will have, for instance, testing the vaccine. Vastly important to do scientific testing, etc., because otherwise people will not have confidence. And so the two things work together inextricably, in my view.
Thank you. Well, just what you said there about the facts, that's one of those areas where, for some people, the curiosity of the Christian Union putting on a week at Imperial, even a Christian Union existing at Imperial, comes into view. Is it possible for someone who cares about the facts, someone who values science, to take the Christian faith seriously? And to make it more personal for you, have you ever felt any tension between being a serious scientist and having faith as a Christian?
Well, taking the Christian faith seriously has played a huge role in the history of modern science, and that's often forgotten. When we look back, the great pioneering minds, Galileo, Kepler, Newton, Clerk Maxwell, Babbage, and so on, in science, it has been observed that they are all theists, most of them Christians. And C.S. Lewis put it brilliantly when summarizing Alfred North Whitehead. He said this: men became scientific. Sadly, there were no women scientists then. There are lots now. Men became scientific because they expected law in nature. And they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. And let me put it very bluntly, I'm not remotely ashamed in being a scientist and a Christian, because arguably it was Christianity gave me my subject. Because you see, often people think, well, Christians are people of faith. Well, yes, they are, faith in God and in Christ, but scientists are people of faith. They're people of faith, not necessarily in God, but in the rational intelligibility of the universe. Now, I was taught quantum physics by Professor Sir John Polkinghorne, and he constantly reminds people that physics is powerless to explain its faith, note the word, in the rational intelligibility of the universe, because, very simply, you have to believe that the universe is rationally intelligible before you do any physics. So, in other words, I believe that science can be done. If you ask me why I believe it, I share with Newton and Kepler and the rest of them the conviction that this is an ordered universe. And that conviction is ultimately traceable to the fact that I believe there's an intelligent, creative, eternal God who made it that way. So it all fits together. And it's very important today, particularly at an institution like Imperial, for folks to realize that science has got its presuppositions. There's a big problem today in the academy as a result, unfortunately, of people thinking that faith is a religious word and it means believing where there's no evidence. If that were the case, I wouldn't be a Christian for a nanosecond. Faith is an ordinary word. It comes from the Latin fides, from which we get fidelity, trust. And if it's to be worth anything, it must be evidence-based. And just as we do evidence-based medicine and evidence-based physics, mine is an evidence-based Christianity.
That's a really stimulating line of approach. To flesh that out then, what are the realities you encounter as a scientist that your faith in Jesus helps you understand or process?
Well, it's first of all, faith in God himself. I'll come to Jesus Christ in a moment. And part of your question, which I didn't answer, was, did I ever feel a tension between faith in God and science? Not inwardly, no, but outwardly. I've been put under enormous pressure and mocked by people like Richard Dawkins publicly and so on. Well, I don't mind that, because mockery is intellectually very superficial and trivial. It's much better to deal with arguments and so on. But my biggest pressure was put on me when I was student age, 19, and sat beside a Nobel Prize winner once at dinner and tried to ask him if his research had led to him thinking there might possibly be a God behind the universe. And he didn't like the discussion, so we backed off. At the end of dinner, he invited me to his room with a number of other senior people, no students. They put me on a chair. And he said, Lennox, do you want a career in science? I said, yes. Well, he said, if you do, give up this naive belief in God, because it'll cripple you intellectually. You'll never get anywhere. You will suffer by comparison with your peers. So give it up now in front of witnesses. Well, that was tension. That was pressure. But I thought afterwards, if he had been a Christian and I'd been an atheist, he'd have probably lost his job the next day. Such is the nature of the academy. So I simply asked him, tell me, what are you offering me that's better than what I've already got? And he came out with a philosophy of which most people will never have heard. It's by Bergson. And I happen to know about it. And I simply said, well, if that's all you've got to offer me, I'll take the risk and I'll stick with Christianity. And I got up and walked out. But I tell you, that put steel into my heart. I thought then, if ever I get into the kind of position I'm in now as a professor at Oxford, I will never attempt to browbeat people in that kind of way. And I'd like those of you watching this to understand that. You're at a wonderful university. You're being gifted with the facilities to think hard about things. And all I try to do is to put some evidence into the field of your thinking so that you can make up your own mind. And for that, you need to hear different perspectives. So that what I've got in my Christian biblical worldview is a meta-narrative that's big enough to give me huge intellectual satisfaction, but not only that, moral, spiritual, a sense of well-being and purpose in life, because of course science is only one aspect of life. There are many other dimensions. And the reason for that is, if I dare say so, is because I believe this meta-narrative is true. Now, there'll be a reaction, perhaps not so much at Imperial as elsewhere in the literary faculties, at a concept of truth. But you scientists, of course you believe in truth. You believe there's something out there to be understood, otherwise you wouldn't be doing it. And often people say to me, we're in a relativistic postmodern generation. Yes, we are, but only for things that people often count unimportant. When it comes down to the fundamental issues of life, truth is crucial. You watch a scientist defending her thesis when somebody says it isn't true, and you'll see whether we believe in truth or not. So it's all of this that focuses together for me, because ultimately I believe that there is truth. Science grasps at it. It never completely gets there. But ultimately, the truth is not a theory, it's a person. And Jesus Christ made the claim, which is stunning. I am the truth, he said. Now, that's more than saying, I say true things. I am the truth means he's the ultimate answer to all our questions. Why the cosmos exists in the first place, why there's something rather than nothing. All these great questions that the late Stephen Hawking wrestled with. So I find myself fitting enormously comfortably into the Christian worldview, and I do not fit into the atheist worldview. This is what astonishes me, that so many scientists are atheists. Why does it astonish me? Because it gives no rationale for doing science. I've had many scientists tell me that they do science with their brain. They don't believe in the mind as a separate concept, whereas I do. And then I ask them about the brain. And they say, well, the brain's the end product of a mindless, unguided process. And I look at them and I say, and you trust it? And then I ask them this, and I've done this with dozens of world-class scientists. I say, look, if you knew that the computer you use every day was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, would you trust it? And I've always, without exception, got the answer no. And I look at them and I say, you've got a problem. You see, ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid one of the reasons I'm a Christian is that I believe in science. And atheism, taken to its logical conclusion, as even atheist philosophers of science are now beginning to see, famously Thomas Nagel sees that there's a huge problem, that evolutionary naturalism, taken to its logical conclusion, undermines rationality. And C.S. Lewis taught me this a long time ago. He said, we do a lot of thinking, but we haven't thought about thinking. And any theory that invalidates thinking cannot be true because you reach it by thinking. So here's my parting shot, if you like, on this topic. You see, shooting yourself in the foot is painful, but this naturalistic philosophy that so many scientists espouse, shoot yourself in the brain, and that tends to be fatal.
Yes, thank you so much. That's really helpful and will help us think about some big things this week as we bear that challenge in mind. Where does our thinking come from? Where does our rationality come from? How do we justify the intellectual exploits we get up to in the lab as we're working through our degrees? Thank you. A final question for you to have a go at. This week, we're going to be thinking through John's Gospel. It's an account of Jesus' life. It's a first-hand account. It comes from the first century. We'll think a little bit about it as a historical text. But above all, we'll be looking at the person of Jesus that it portrays. What does that book, John's Gospel, mean to you as a scientist?
Oh, it means everything to me as a scientist, because it starts with a statement, in the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, the Word was God. And then a bit further down it says, all things were made by him. But the Greek text says something much more powerful. All things came to be through him. This is an existence statement, and it's one of the fundamental questions of science. Where do we come from? Why is there something rather than nothing? And here's the answer to it. The answer to it is that God, the Word, never came to exist. He is eternal. But the universe and ourselves, we came to be, and we came to be through the Word. Now, that fascinates me as a scientist because it's unpacking the statement made in the first chapter of the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the mechanism proposed there, or the way it happened was, and God said, let there be light. And God said, and God said. That is, this is a word-based universe. Now, the literary experts ought to be interested in this. The universe is created through a series of speech acts. And that means the concept of word is fundamental. Now, word in Greek is logos. The Stoics used it for the rational principle behind the universe, but it is a wide range of meanings from command, word, information. And I remember when I said that to a leading cosmologist, he stopped me and he said, are you suggesting that the Bible has the concept of information? And I said, well, what does it look like? You see, at Imperial, you do a lot of highly advanced IT. This is the information age, the wired world, smart cities, the Internet of Things, and all of it. The amazing thing is this, that in its economical description of the origin of everything, the Bible puts its finger on the central concept of modern physics, and that is information. This is a word-based universe. That's the exact opposite, the polar opposite of the idea that the universe came to be through a series of unguided natural processes. That, of course, is an argument for another time. Now, this being so, here I've got an answer to why there's something rather than nothing, because God caused it to be. You see, it's common for many physicists to say we get a universe from nothing. They're only partly right. The universe came from nothing physical, but it didn't come from nothing. It came from God, who is spirit, who created it, and God is most assuredly not nothing. I've actually written about this in my book on God and Stephen Hawking. But then comes something much bigger. The word created. The universe, you and I, came to be through the word. But then the word that never came to be, says John, came to be human, because that's the literal translation of the text. The word became human, became flesh, and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. And this is a staggering claim that you're going to be considered this week, that the word, who invented the atom, who invented biochemical pathways, who invented information, quantized universe, came to be human. And let me say this to you. Why I regard this as important is this. It gives us a value for human beings that is utterly unique in any philosophy. I was listening to Jordan Peterson, as I hope that some of you have done from time to time, and he was very interestingly describing a statement in the book of Genesis, chapter 1. And he said, human beings are made in the image of God. And I reflected on that because, you see, the universe shows God's glory. I've got a telescope, a 10-inch telescope in my garden. I love looking at the galaxies, particularly Andromeda and the Orion Nebula and so on. But when Jordan Peterson read this, created in the image of God, he stopped and he said, man, that is the central basis for civilization, at least in the West. It gives us dignity and value. The universe shows God's glory. It was not made in his image. You were. Now, I want to take seriously a worldview that gives me that kind of value. And now we come to the crowning point. How special are human beings? They're so special that God could become one. Now, I hope this week, as Niv leads you through, that you realize that you are investigating the biggest claim that you will ever face, going beyond all science, all philosophical systems invented by human beings, because this claims to be God's revelation. You can test it. Check out and you can find out it's true. My final point for you is simple. People often say to me, how could you be a scientist and believe in Christianity? It's not testable. Of course it is. Jesus Christ promised. Let me let you into this, but Niv can explain it in another evening. He promised that those who recognized who he was and trusted him for salvation, to free them from guilt, and we're all guilty, folks, to give them peace. And I suspect many of you know a lack of peace. We need peace, all of us. We need forgiveness for the mess we've made of our own lives and the lives of other people even. Jesus Christ promised he'd give us all those things if we faced our sin and repented of it and trusted him. And he'd give us power to lead a new life. Now, I'm 77. I've worked with students all my life, and so often I've met students who've been at the end of their tether, perhaps addicted to narcotics or alcohol or something else, and they're in despair. And 6 months later, I meet them and they're radiant. And I say, what has happened to you? And they may say, well, I met Christ, or I became a Christian, or I'm now a believer, or I got converted. But whatever they're saying, the reality of it shows in their lives. And I wouldn't be remotely interested in Christianity if it didn't do two things. It gives me serious intellectual fulfillment, validates my work as a scientist, but above everything else, gives me a friendship with God and gives me a purpose in life and a sheer joy that will transcend the heat death of the universe.
Wonderful. Professor Lennox, thank you so much. You've given us so much to think about as scientists and also to whet our appetites for looking at John's Gospel. Thank you so much for your time this evening.
Pleasure.
That was such a powerful interview. I particularly enjoyed when Professor Lennox said that his faith in God is so intricately linked to his role as a scientist, and that really, as scientists, and most of us here at Imperial, we do operate with the faith that there is a rational intelligibility in this world. If you want to know more about John Lennox's work and read some of his books, you can find out more on his website, which is johnlennox.org.
And now let's listen to a talk from Niv about the man who doesn't just claim to speak the truth, but to be the truth.
Well, I found that interview fascinating, and I hope you did as well. And now I just want us to consider one big idea as an epilogue to what Professor Lennox said. Here it is. There are two different ways we can say, science can't explain that. And one way is not very helpful. It's when we say that because science can't explain something now, it never will. And the past 5 or so centuries has shown that that is not a wise route to take. Science has proven tremendously capable of casting light on reality. There have been new discoveries, shifting paradigms, advances in technology. You wouldn't bet against science telling us new and undreamt of things. But there is another way in which we can say, science can't explain that, which is true and important. And I'm talking now about all the things we have to assume in order to do science in the first place. And we can't use science to check that those assumptions are true, because we have to make those assumptions in order to do our science. And so if we said that science can prove those assumptions, that would be what philosophers call a vicious circularity. And one assumption we have to make is that we can trust human logic and rationality to do our science. Now, if we take God out of the picture, then humanity developed over millennia by a process of unguided evolution. And therefore, the intellectual and rational and logical resources we use to understand the truth about reality are nothing more than evolved survival strategies. To repeat Professor Lennox's point, why on earth should we trust what we know if all we know is nothing more than evolutionary offcuts? There's nothing more than chemistry bubbling away in our brains. What reason do we have for confidence in those processes to tell us about reality? Francis Crick, you might know him, involved in the discovery of DNA, and I hope this image is... Ooh, nearly dropped it. I hope it's visible. He once famously made this declaration. You, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will, are in fact no more than the behaviour of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. To which the theoretical physicist John Polkinghorne, a picture of him there, once replied like this. If Crick's thesis is true, we could never know it, for it destroys rationality. Thought is replaced by electrochemical neural events. The very assertions of the reductionist himself are nothing but blips in the neural network of his brain. The world of rational discourse dissolves into the absurd chatter of firing synapses. You see, in order to make the assertion that all we are is matter, we end up relying on all manner of non-material things. And we'll think about that question more tomorrow. But you see, in order to do our science, we posit an idea of rationality and logic that is itself beyond matter. Take that away, and we undermine ourselves as thinkers and knowers. Science becomes impossible. And as we'll be seeing a lot more tomorrow evening, treating science as the only valid way to know things robs us of the ability to make sense of life itself. The surgeon and writer Paul Kalanithi, picture of him there, you may have read his book, When Breath Becomes Air, a really poignant memoir. He once put it like this. To make science the arbiter of metaphysics is to banish not only God from the world, but also love, hate, meaning, to consider a world that is self-evidently not the world we live in. Let me share an example of that from a historian called Carl Trueman. If you asked me, why did the Twin Towers collapse on September the 11th, 2001? And if I then replied to your question, because of the law of gravity, duh, would I have really answered your question? Would I have told you all the things you need to know about that event? In terms of physical processes, well, what I said wasn't wrong. But I think we all understand that that answer hasn't begun to explain that event. I think we all understand that you need to start talking about different cultures and exploring the historical conflict and events that led up to it. There are layers to that incident, which scientific investigation isn't able to perceive and isn't trying to perceive. But that doesn't mean that they aren't there or that they don't matter. We need the sciences and we can't do without them. But they aren't the only thing we need when it comes to understanding reality. One of my favourite writers, Marilyn Robinson, picture of her here, once put it like this. This is a lengthy quote, but bear with me. She says, "In fact, there is no perspective from which science as science can regard human life and say that there is a beautiful, terrible mystery in it all, a great pathos. Art, music, and religion tell us that. And what they tell us is true, not after the fashion of a magisterium that is legitimate only so long as it does not overlap the autonomous republic of science. It is true because it takes account of the universal variable, human nature, which shapes everything it touches, science as surely and profoundly as anything else. The universal variable, human nature. No one can ignore this universal variable. There's no way for us to go outside human nature in order to ascertain what is and isn't true and whether we can find that out. Human nature is the inescapable vantage point from which we view all things, even when we're busy in the lab or doing our computing. So how can we make sense of life and our capacity as knowers? How can we get to grips with that universal variable of our own nature? To underline what Professor Lennox said, the central claim of Christianity can help us here. The term logos was a common philosophical concept in the ancient world, and it stood for the principle of universal rationality. It was the theory of everything, if you like. It was the thing that gave the cosmos coherence. The logos is what unified reality and made it hang together. Now, to take a slightly more recent definition of that from Professor Stephen Hawking, the late great, here's how he ended his famous book, A Brief History of Time. Even if there is only one possible unified theory, and it is just a set of rules and equations, what is it that breathes fire into the equations and makes a universe for them to describe? What is it, he's asking, that really makes this rationality something that describes reality? He's asking, in other words, what's the logos? And Christianity began with a unique declaration that the logos, the theory of everything, is a person. And this person did not stay distant from us. This person, at the heart of reality, has shown his face. Here's the beginning of John's Gospel, making that claim as Professor Lennox shared it earlier. In the beginning was the Word, the Logos, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. And jumping on just a little bit later, the Word, the Logos, became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. The Logos is a person, not an abstract theory or rational principle, but a person. God making himself known in Jesus, a person in history, showing us that we're not fools to trust human rationality or live by logic or value science and all that it shows us. And by coming to us as one of us, Jesus shows how life isn't just something we get to understand, but something we also get to enjoy in relationship with him. Every night this week, we'll have an opportunity to see how Jesus offers himself to our searching and our questions. There'll be more interviews, opportunities to dig into John's Gospel. And I recommend reading it for yourself, something you could find online, something that the Christian Union at Imperial would be happy to give you. Perhaps you could even get in touch with someone to read it with you and see for yourself. I was an atheist, actually, for myself before I took this book seriously in my mid-teens. And I'd love to challenge you to take up the evidence and see for yourself. That's what this week is all about. And if you're someone who loves science, then that means you're someone who loves taking claims seriously and taking up the evidence. Can I invite you to do that this week?
What stood out to me is that the theory of everything turns out to be a person who stepped into this world and invites us to know him. If this is something that piqued your interest or you want to know more, the Christian Union are running a series of events that you can get involved with.
So first of all, we have Mondays with Mark starting next week, where there'll be a series of talks being given by students at Imperial from the Gospel of Mark, looking at what Jesus did. There'll be a discussion following that. We also have Curious Cafe, which is running every Monday at 6 p.m, where we look at the Gospel of John, an eyewitness account of Jesus' life. And we get to see for ourselves who Jesus really is. And the final thing, if you're interested at all, you can actually read the Bible one-to-one with someone else in the CU. Just fill out the form in the description.
So I really encourage you to get involved with any of the three using the form in the description. And finally, we're going to move on to the last part of this evening, which is a live Q&A, and I look forward to seeing your questions.